Warford updates with Mr. Warford updates with Mr. Warford updates with Mr. Warford.
What's up? I'm the Updates with Mr. Warford. This is from my world history people. We're going to start getting into major events of World War I. We're going to spend a few days this week and a few days next week on that. We're just going to hit the highlights, okay? So when the war starts in 1914, there's this sense of optimism. Everybody's like, the war's going to be over soon. Our side's going to win because of nationalism. Everybody thinks their side's going to win. But as the summer of 1914 turns into fall, the war turns into a stalemate or a deadlock along the battlefields of France. This region of northern France is going to be called the Western Front, and this is where a lot of the fighting is going to take place, this little expanse between Germany and France. A lot of fighting along the Western Front, a lot of trench warfare along the Western Front, and not a lot of movement. There's not a lot of ground being gained or lost. Germany, at the onset of the war, has this thing called the Schlieffen Plan, and this was their master plan, their grand plan to win World War I that they had actually created before World War I even started. So what they wanted to do was quickly attack France in the Western Front and then move over to the east and rush in to fight Russia. By defeating France and Russia, two of the main Allied powers, they would win World War I. They counted on a slow mobilization of Russian forces because their military was not as strong as Germany's, and because they had a lack of urbanization and lack of railroads. But their plan eventually failed because they rushed into Germany and thought, we're going to mop them up really fast. Didn't happen. They actually lost a battle in September of 1914 that pushed them back and kind of threw a wrench in the Schlieffen Plan. And so then they were forced to fight a two-front war. So they're both fighting on the Western Front and what's known as the Eastern Front. So the Schlieffen Plan, you need to know for your test, was a failure. Did not work. Made the war go on longer. We're not going to cover specific battles in this class, but just know that some of these major battles were causing extremely high casualties. So if we look at Verdun, the Somme, Ypres, hundreds of thousands of casualties per battle, and not a lot of territory gained. If you look here, for some of these battles, only 5 miles of territory were gained by these battles. So hundreds of thousands of young men are dying, only to have a few miles gained or lost, which is pretty tragic. Now, with the Western Front here, fighting going on there, there's also fighting, like I said earlier, on the Eastern Front, which is along the Russian and German border. Early in World War I, Russians push into Austria-Hungary and Germany, but are soon forced to retreat. Russia suffered a lot during this war because they had not a lot of supplies, suffering a lot of casualties. Their casualties are ranking up in the millions by the end of World War I, or by the time they bow out of World War I. Their losses outnumber their victories. And later we're going to talk about in this unit how they simultaneously have a revolution going on in their country. However, they have a huge army. May not be the most well-equipped, but they have a huge army that's going to pester Germany and for a chunk of the war make them fight a two-front war on the Eastern and Western Front, which is going to have an effect. And they're also going to pester Austria-Hungary here for a chunk of the war. So they do have an effect, even though they are losing tons of soldiers and there's a lot of suffering going on, as well as a revolution going on in their country. They do have an effect on the Eastern Front. Also during the war, the Gallipoli campaign. So the Allies really wanted this little expanse here. If you look at the circle on the map, this place called Gallipoli. All right, they wanted to be able to take ships through here into the Black Sea to help the Russian Empire. Does not work out that way. Between 1915 and 1916, the Ottoman Empire here is going to fight back, cause over 200,000 casualties of British French, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers. All right, so it was a failure for the Allies. So while the Allies are going to win World War I eventually, Gallipoli was a failure. And here's a little video if you want some background on that. World War I involved many European colonies. Remember when we talked about colonialization, imperialism, nationalism? So across the world, Allied powers are going to tap into their European colonies to get people to fight for them. So the Allies overran German colonies in Africa and Asia, while also recruiting people from India, the French West African territory, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which were all colonies of European powers at this time. And many people in the colonies thought that by fighting for the colonial governments that they were under at this time, that they could possibly win independence after the war. So you might be thinking, why the heck would they fight for people that colonized their land? It was because they thought, hey, if we show that we're great soldiers, maybe we'll work towards independence. So that was why they fought for their colonizers, essentially. And this is, by the very nature of it, it is a world war. So while there's a lot going on in Europe, that's where most of the fighting is happening. Japan later declares war on Germany in 1914, capturing German colonies in China and the Pacific. Arab groups are going to revolt in the Ottoman Empire here and overthrow Ottoman rule by the end of World War I. Italy, which was initially linked to the Central Powers, is going to flip and show that they are on the side of the Allies. They're going to fight Austria-Hungary, but had little progress there. And then also a huge event that is not talked a lot about in world history classes is the Armenian Genocide. Okay, the Ottomans claimed that Armenians were aiding Russians in this area called the Caucasus Mountains. Armenians are like an ethnic group, and Ottomans began to forcibly remove and kill Armenians from that area, and more than 600,000 died. And some people, there's no real records of this happening as far as like the amount of people that died. Some people even rank it into the millions. So during World War I, while there's a war going on, there's also a genocide going on, which is really terrible. So Armenians were persecuted during World War I by the Ottoman Empire. So what we're going to get into while we're learning the key or major events of World War I is we're also going to look at a really influential book called All Quiet on the Western Front. It's one of the best known books ever about war, any war, World War I or otherwise. It was published in Germany in 1928 and 1929. It was a novel, but it was based on the real-life experiences of this man here. He is the author. And it sold millions of copies and was made into an American film in 1930, one of the most famous war stories ever. It was so influential that when Adolf Hitler later came to power in Germany post-World War I, leading into World War II, the Nazi Party actually publicly burned his books and took away his citizenship in the 1930s, and he was forced to immigrate to the United States. So Germans actually persecuted him for talking bad about the German war effort during World War I, but it really casts a light onto the experience of individual soldiers in World War I. So what we're going to do is I want you to, over the next few days, I want you to work on an All Quiet on the Western Front reading excerpt assignment. And then when you're done with that, continue to work on your Unit 9 study guide. Over the next few days, we are going to work on this while also covering major events of the war. So if you have any questions for me, let me know. In the coming week, we're going to cover the Russian Revolution that I mentioned earlier. We're going to talk about how the United States is going to enter the war, and then eventually the end of the war and how it led to the rise of dictators in World War II. So if you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day.